Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about the HOA that was building on my land. I remember the exact moment I realized something very strange was happening on my property. It was early morning, and I had just stepped out of my car to admire the sunrise over the mountains. The view is always breathtaking, rays of gold and soft pink stretching across the rugged peaks. Owning this land had been my dream since childhood, and I finally managed to make that dream a reality after years of saving and some solid successes in my legal career. From the very beginning, I intended to keep the space mostly untouched, except for my own home and a few small structures I'd carefully planned. But on that crisp morning, what I saw in the distance was jarringly out of place. A cluster of brand new houses with bright roofs that seemed to gleam in the early sunlight. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, or maybe the neighbors down the road were expanding. But these houses appeared well within the boundaries I owned. The more I squinted to make sense of the sight, the more confusion took over. I spotted multiple residences neatly lined up in small clusters, and the sound of construction vehicles rumbled in the distance. The next thing I noticed, and this left me stunned, was a towering piece of equipment drilling into the ground for a swimming pool. 5 pools, to be exact. I could make out separate excavations all spaced out evenly among certain sets of houses. It looked alarmingly official, as if an entire subdivision had sprung up out of nowhere. I've worked as an attorney for quite some time, and I've dealt with real estate disputes, contract battles, and boundary issues before. Yet never had I encountered something this baffling happening on my own land. I had the relevant title documents, the survey maps, and every official record proving I owned this property. How could someone construct multiple houses and 5 pools on land that belonged to me, without my permission or even my knowledge? I hopped back into my car and drove toward the newly built structures to get a closer look. The main road on my property was still covered in gravel, as I'd never fully paved it. Nonetheless, I saw fresh concrete leading into what appeared to be brand new driveways. It was surreal, like stumbling into an alternate reality. I passed by a couple of workers who nodded politely, probably assuming I was part of whatever project they were working on. As I parked near the largest house of the cluster, I noticed a sign in the yard that read something along the lines of, "Welcome to Mountain View Oasis, an HOA community." My blood pressure rose instantly when I read the words HOA community. I had never signed on to any homeowners association. I had no intention of sharing my land with a controlling board that could boss me around about what color my front door could be or which day I could put out the trash. The entire concept was against my preference for independence and personal freedom. My first thought was to check with the county recorder's office or city planning department to see if someone had filed any claims or permits under my land. But I also needed to talk to whoever was in charge of this so-called Mountain View Oasis. As I approached the largest house, I could see a few people inside through the tall windows, setting up what looked like a sales office. There were brochures arranged on a table by the entrance, large renderings of a planned community, and the words Phase 1, 25 houses, 5 pools, in bold across the top of a stand-up display board. It was almost comical how they had laid out the entire plan in plain sight. I walked in, doing my best to stay calm, though my heart was racing from anger and confusion. A woman wearing business casual clothes rushed over to greet me. She introduced herself as Misty, someone apparently working for a real estate development outfit. When I asked what they were doing on this land, she seemed taken aback. "This is part of the planned development for the Mountain View Oasis HOA," she said, flipping through a binder as though the answer was self-evident. "Where did you get the permission to build all this?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice measured. She hesitated, then explained that the Landowners Association Board had approved the construction months ago, and they had begun building once the final permits were supposedly cleared. My next question, naturally, was who the landowner might be, because it certainly wasn't me in that capacity, or so they believed. She gave me a name, Karen. A wave of frustration coursed through me. I had never heard of any Karen who had authority over my property. Something about the entire situation felt like an elaborate scam, but the houses were physically here, so it wasn't just on paper. This was real. They had built 25 houses, 5 groups of 5 houses each, and installed 5 pools. I insisted on seeing the documents that gave them authority, but Misty said Karen was the person in charge and that Karen would have all the official paperwork. That day, I left the site in a rush. I was practically shaking as I got back into my car and headed straight to City Hall. I was determined to find out if building permits had been filed. If so, how was that possible without me signing off? If not, someone was in for a monumental legal headache. The city offices were typically slow, but I had connections. Being an attorney has its perks. People pick up your calls, and they know you aren't going to give up easily. I reached a city official I'd known for years and asked him to look into any records or permits. Sure enough, there were some documents referencing a piece of land near the mountains, with a partial matching address to mine, but they were riddled with inconsistencies. The official was as stunned as I was. Everything pointed to a massive error or a case of fraud. While I waited for updates from the city, I dug out my original property survey and the official deed that clearly showed my boundaries. I studied them carefully, triple-checking that no one else had any legal claim. As expected, it was unequivocally mine. No easement or partial boundary extension existed that could justify another party building houses without my explicit permission. That evening, I contacted a few specialist attorneys I knew, people who handle real estate law, fraud, and large-scale property disputes. I explained the bizarre situation to them. They all shared the same initial reaction: disbelief. After we got past that, they assured me that if someone really had built on my land without my permission, I was well within my rights to have those structures declared trespasses. I could potentially demand they be torn down, or I could claim ownership of the improvements under certain state laws. In some parts of the country, if someone builds on your land, those improvements might default to you unless there's a prior agreement. Regardless, the developer and the so-called HOA had a serious problem. All I needed to do now was compile evidence and proceed carefully. The next day, I decided to confront whoever this Karen person was. According to Misty, Karen showed up at the construction site every week to oversee progress. I arrived at the site in the mid-afternoon when the desert sun was still scorching. Sure enough, I recognized Karen right away from the sense of entitlement in her posture. She wore a bright outfit, carried a clipboard, and was giving instructions to a group of workers as though she were the queen of the whole development. When she noticed me approaching, she gave a curt nod, probably assuming I was another staffer under her control. "Hi, Karen," I said plainly. "We need to talk about this property." She stared at me, blinking slowly. "Yes?" Her tone suggested that she already found me an inconvenience. I handed her my card. "I'm the owner of this land, and I'm also an attorney. I'd like to know why you're building houses here." Her eyes flickered with confusion before she pursed her lips. "I'm sorry, that can't be right. This is part of the Mountain View Oasis development, and I'm the head of the HOA. The land is basically earmarked for our community. The developer assured us all the legal steps were followed." She paused and glared at me. "We don't just let random people roam around here." I took a moment to breathe because it was clear she wasn't processing the situation calmly. "Well, I have the original deed and the county records that prove this is my land. It's been in my possession for years. I never sold it, never leased it, and certainly never gave your HOA the right to build anything. This entire development is on property that belongs to me, and it's not part of any homeowners association." She refused to accept that. Instead, she tapped her clipboard with a pen. "That's impossible. We have all the paperwork. The developer said the entire area is under the association's rules. There must be a mistake on your end." I couldn't help but give a short, incredulous laugh. "A mistake on my end? I'll be more than happy to show you my official records if you can show me yours. And if your documents are somehow a forgery or they reference a property that's not actually here, that's a matter for the courts. My guess is you might have scammed yourself, or you've scammed a bunch of people." Karen's face tightened and she started to get defensive. "Scam? We're a legitimate HOA. We're collecting association fees. Several of these houses have already been sold to paying members. You can't just show up and claim everything is yours." I bit back a surge of anger. "That's exactly what's happening, though. I assure you, I have the resources and the contacts to straighten this out fast. In fact, I'll be filing legal action immediately. If you and any buyers you roped into this want to avoid an even larger financial disaster, you'll want to talk settlement soon." She stomped away, refusing to listen, muttering that I'd hear from our attorneys. That was fine by me. I was eager to hear how they would defend this fiasco. Within a few days, I did indeed receive a cease and desist letter from some law office claiming I was harassing the new residents. The letter stated that the HOA had the rightful authority to manage the community, that I was trespassing on property that belonged to them, and that I should remove myself from the premises or face legal consequences. It was audacious, to say the least. My own attorney friends found it laughable and borderline comedic. Once we compared all the official records, it was clear the developer's permits had incorrectly identified the land. It looked like a situation where they might have intended to build on a nearby parcel owned by a different entity that was part of the HOA. Somehow, they had used flawed GPS or boundary lines, or perhaps some more suspicious misrepresentation, and ended up building on my land by mistake. The scale of the error was shocking. 25 entire houses, plus 5 large swimming pools spaced out, so each cluster of 5 houses had access to one. It was no minor slip of a fence line. I began building my case, gathering evidence, official maps, photographs, and witness accounts. I consulted with multiple specialists in property law, zoning, surveying, and even environmental impact assessment. Each one confirmed that I was clearly in the right. Sometimes in real estate disputes, lines can be fuzzy, but in this instance, the line was crystal clear. The new HOA community was planted deep into my acreage. Meanwhile, Karen and some of her associates tried to continue with business as usual. They walked around the new houses, making notes, explaining to potential buyers that there was a legal dispute, but it would be resolved soon. They framed me as some disgruntled individual who was trying to sabotage their legitimate development. Word got back to me from one of the potential buyers, a colleague who recognized my name as the rightful landowner. This buyer withdrew their offer and told me how apologetic the real estate agents became. I couldn't help but pity the innocent people who might have sunk their money into a house that was built on land the developer had no right to use. One bright morning, after I had everything lined up, I took the legal route. My attorneys filed an official lawsuit for trespass, seeking an injunction to halt further construction and a declaration that these houses were indeed on my land. We also sought damages for any environmental harm done to my property, since they had excavated soil to build not just foundations, but multiple pools as well. The developer tried to fight back, but they quickly realized the monumental mistake they had made. Their attorneys attempted to shift blame to Karen and the HOA. Karen tried to shift blame back to the developer. Each side insisted they were misled. Meanwhile, I was just waiting for the judge to rule on the preliminary injunction, so we could put a stop to all further building. That was my immediate goal. End the encroachment. I thought Karen's hostility might ease once the legal reality set in, but it actually flared even more. She began telling the new residents, and even the construction crews, that I was a nuisance who would eventually be forced to join the HOA. She claimed that my failure to pay dues would be rectified by the courts, and that I'd be left with no choice but to comply with the association's rules. Little did she know I'd already proven in court that I was never part of her HOA in the first place. The arrogance was astounding. In the midst of all this, I had multiple side battles brewing. The city's involvement. Because the developer had used apparently legitimate permits, though referencing the wrong plot, the city building inspectors came to check the safety and compliance of these new houses. I had to meet with them to clarify that I hadn't approved any of it. They were flabbergasted. The city ended up imposing a temporary freeze on occupancy permits until the legal situation was resolved. Utility companies. The new community had begun hooking up utilities, water, electricity, gas, and I was receiving bizarre bills. The addresses were so confusing that some of the utility accounts were defaulting to my name because I owned the overarching property. I spent hours on the phone with representatives, proving that I hadn't authorized any connections. Eventually, the utility companies placed a hold on all new hookups. This caused an uproar among the newly placed residents who were under the impression they had a fully functioning home. Some folks were stuck with partial utilities, or none at all. Environmental impact. A local conservation group with which I had a friendly relationship reached out after noticing the sudden construction near the mountains. They wondered if I had sold the land or changed my mind about preserving much of it. I explained the situation, and they were outraged that habitat and vegetation had been disrupted by a project that didn't even have the correct land rights. This group threatened to file their own legal complaints if the damage wasn't fixed. I reassured them that once I regained control, I would restore as much of the land as possible. Residents in limbo. A few families had apparently bought houses in this new development without suspecting anything was wrong. They'd sunk their savings into what they believed was a legitimate purchase. I truly felt sorry for them because they were innocent victims, and at the same time, They were living on my land. The law typically says that if someone builds on your property without permission, you have a right to remove them. However, I also recognize that these families had been duped by unscrupulous players. My attorney suggested that if the court ruled in my favor, I could negotiate a sale or a lease to them for the homes, but on my terms. Nonetheless, we had to settle the bigger question first, that these houses were indeed built without my permission and belonged, by default, to me. At Karen, the developers and their attorneys attended the preliminary hearing. I had 3 lawyers and a stack of documents thicker than my law school textbooks. My attorney presented the deed, official surveys, and an aerial map to the judge as core evidence, making the situation almost laughably simple. Karen's side, representing the HOA, argued that they were informed the land was part of the association. The developers' counsel claimed it was an honest mistake, but that their client had acted in good faith. None of their arguments could overcome property records' black and white reality. Period. They built on someone else's land. The judge issued a temporary injunction stopping construction and said I had a substantial likelihood of success on the merits. Karen stormed out, and the developer's attorneys looked worried. That was just the start. Depositions and document exchanges revealed weeks later that Karen had pushed for the development. Trusting incomplete or inaccurate maps, the developer used incorrect data. It was either intentional to expand the HOA's footprint or a massive mistake, but the result was the same. The HOA attorney sent me a notice to pay association dues for my houses if I wanted to claim them during the lawsuit. As the house owner, I must follow the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, they wrote. Reading that letter made me laugh so hard. I politely but firmly told them I was not a member of their HOA and that they had no legal right to demand anything from me. I was not building my houses under their covenant. Trespassing was the only reason these houses existed. If I kept them in a strange situation, I didn't have to join their organization. My attorneys laughed at how they tried to charge me fees and rules when their development was on the wrong land. Karen bombarded me with frantic voicemails one morning. She seemed insane, saying I was ruining lives and that the new community families were blaming her. They allegedly threatened legal action against the HOA for selling them foreclosed or removed houses. Her confidence was gone. She begged to talk to me. I called her back politely, but she started yelling about how I needed to fix the situation. Fix it? I repeated, trying to stay calm. I didn't cause this mess. You built on my land without permission. No other solution exists. Your developer and HOA must pay. She insisted, but you can't just take these homes away from people. They invested everything. My attorneys and I are working on a fair resolution for the good faith buyers, I said. You and the developer are liable. It's not my job to rescue you for your oversight. Karen went on about how unfair this was, how the neighbors had come together to build a great community, and how I would be seen as a monster if I kept pursuing the lawsuit. Reminding her that she had chosen a legal battle from the start ended the call. She wanted me to save her now that the law was against her. I rejected her manipulation. The judge's decision in my favor was the next major development. The ruling said the land was mine, so I could claim the houses and improvements built without permission. The developer trespassed, and the HOA overstepped by enforcing regulations on non-HOA property. The judge left damages and house disposition open, but said I could refuse HOA membership. After fighting, the developer's attorneys approached me about a settlement. They tried to buy my land or pay me for the houses to salvage something. However, the real estate market was changing and the scandal was public, making the situation toxic. Knowing I had the upper hand, I considered options. They could demolish everything and restore the land to its natural state. Another idea was to keep the houses, sell them to the unfortunate buyers at a fair but profitable price, and form a small HOA-free community, considering selling them on the open market. My attorneys noted that since I was never part of the HOA, new residents buying directly from me wouldn't have to deal with those restrictions, which could be a selling point. Separate from my claims, the developer and Karen would face lawsuits from misled buyers. Karen tried one last strategy while I deliberated. She reassured me she wanted to cooperate to help the families. She offered to put me on the HOA board and fix everything from the inside. She tried to flatter me by implying that my legal expertise would benefit the association. Never forget my response. You still don't understand, Karen. I will never join your HOA. I don't have to fix your mistakes. Please don't contact me unless you're ready to negotiate a formal settlement where you accept full responsibility." She hung up before I finished, probably furious I didn't take her bait. After that call, my attorney informed me that Karen and the developer were rushing to settle the duped homebuyer lawsuits. Some families lost all financing after banks discovered the property fiasco. Some wanted to move and demanded reimbursement for their expenses. The community Karen imagined was crumbling. Build on unowned land, and that happens. I didn't like evicting families who didn't know they were buying an illegal development. I agreed with my attorneys to sign individual contracts for the lots their houses stood on and sell them the property directly at a fair market rate without HOA involvement for those families who were interested. They had to sign waivers admitting the developer was at fault and releasing me from any claims. These families could legally own their homes without Karen's association. Some took the chance, grateful to escape the HOA. Others left, requesting developer refunds. Some couldn't get financing after the fiasco, so their houses sat vacant. About half of the 25 houses went to owners who bought them from me. After the fiasco, those families were fairly compensated and could keep living in their chosen location without HOA rules. The other half sold to buyers who wanted a new house near the mountains without association covenants. Due to the uncertain status, I was able to negotiate a fraction of the developer's costs for the improvements. Ironically, these homes made me a lot of money. My land plan wasn't perfect, but it was a blessing after all the stress. Karen's HOA role was being challenged by many residents in her original community, last I heard. She was shunned after the association was sued for negligence and misrepresentation. The developer faced more lawsuits and may have had to declare bankruptcy. Their insurance companies probably complained about the whole mess. I was completely outside HOA jurisdiction. Karen claimed I owed them fees for a while, but I never paid her. She had no legal recourse, and in an odd twist, a year after the court ruling, a small group of people in the newly formed neighborhood invited me to a reconciliation barbecue to thank me for working with them fairly. I attended because these people were wrongfully involved. With grilled food, kids playing on the lawns, and neighbors talking about life, I felt welcome. Some told me they were relieved to no longer fear losing their homes or being in a corrupt HOA. It was inspiring to see a community form from a huge mistake despite the chaos. One of the new homeowners told me at the barbecue that Karen had called them multiple times, claiming she still had authority over the area, apparently forgetting the court's ruling. They politely told her to leave the property or be reported for trespassing. Karen's denial was still strong, but nobody was listening. Homeowners formed a small association, not a HOA. It was a neighborhood watch group that kept the area clean and safe, not imposed ridiculous fines or aesthetic standards. They said Karen's governance wasn't welcome. I left a good portion of the mountainous land untouched. Environmental specialists are helping me repair construction damage. Even though part of the land is residential, we hope to preserve much of its natural beauty. I taught each new homeowner about environmental respect. Many expressed enthusiasm for preserving the scenic landscape, planting native plants, and reducing noise and pollution, which delighted me. Though exhausting, the ordeal ended in a way that helped me financially and gave some good people stable homes. Karen and the dishonest developer lost big. They risked building on unclaimed land through negligence or misrepresentation. They threatened legal action but lost. It shows the importance of verifying property boundaries before pouring concrete and raising buildings. I'm glad justice was served, but I'll never forget the legal whirlwind, environmental concerns, and emotional upheaval. At least the new homeowners no longer have an oppressive HOA, and I still own the undeveloped land. All Karen's attempts to expand her kingdom failed, which is poetic justice. I still shock people when I tell them how I found an entire neighborhood and multiple swimming pools on my land. The best part is seeing people's faces when I tell them the HOA tried to charge me for houses I never requested. Without living it, I wouldn't believe it. Legal channels kept me updated on the aftermath. The developer was fined heavily for building without permission and had to compensate many buyers who left. Karen was ousted from the original community by a wave of angry homeowners who blamed her for the disaster. Once she left, those in her original development cleaned up the association's rules and made them less burdensome. The fiasco may have improved their lives, but not in the way Karen intended. The final part of the litigation addressed long-term infrastructure management, roads, sidewalks, utilities. The new development had private roads because the land was mine. I persuaded the local authorities to let the city maintain the roads for a fair price and a promise to repair any environmental damage. Most new homeowners wanted public streets, so it was a good compromise. I was also exempt from managing or funding future road repairs. The city took over that responsibility, further separating the new neighborhood from any HOA claim because public roads cannot be regulated by a HOA. That ended Karen's dreams. I occasionally receive a phone call or email from someone who heard the story through the grapevine after the settlement. They're often shocked and want to know if a HOA built 25 houses and 5 pools on private property they didn't own. I sometimes laugh internally when I confirm. It happened. A subdivision crossed a property line, not just a porch or fence. Many say they've heard crazy HOA stories, but this one takes the cake. I agree mostly. In recent months, I've spent more time at my self-built house on the far side of the property. My favorite pastime is watching the sunset over the mountains, and now I can do it without worrying about another unapproved development. The families who bought lots from me are friendly neighbors. They know I value my privacy and respect their right to enjoy the houses I sold them. We get along, which is better than I expected given how this started. This whole saga has made me focus more on real estate law in my practice, which is interesting. When companies and HOAs overestimate or ignore property rights, things can go wrong, as I've seen firsthand. I now represent clients with smaller issues like neighbors building a deck across property lines or HOAs enforcing illegal covenants. Living through this monstrous fiasco gave me insight no textbook could. My contract law and civil litigation background helps. I sometimes think that if I hadn't driven out to my property that morning, I might have been unaware for weeks or months. It may have been more complicated when I found the houses. Karen and her developer friends may have manipulated the system if I was less vigilant or connected in the legal world. Any property owner should keep an eye on their land, confirm their boundaries, and don't assume someone won't try to claim it, whether intentionally or not. Throughout, my legal system confidence grew surprisingly. Despite being stressful and taking longer than expected, the courts upheld the evidence and protected my rights. My attorneys were great, and my surveying, environmental law, and real estate contacts were invaluable. It showed that due process works when you're persistent and prepared, even though property law in this country is complicated. As a final chapter, I used some of the developer's settlement money for roads and environmental costs to fund a small local conservation project with that friendly environmental group. They're replanting native trees and shrubs around the new neighborhood to create a wildlife habitat. This is my small way of making the best of a bad situation. New families are excited about the greenery and volunteer to plant. Karen tried to create a hostile environment, but they bond over preserving the land. I doubt Karen or the original developer would understand that their reckless illegal building has created a more peaceful, eco-conscious, and HOA-free neighborhood. If they had approached me with a legitimate offer and respect for the land, we might have avoided all the chaos. Given Karen's history, chaos may have been inevitable. I never joined a HOA and never will. The 25 houses are mine because I control their resale. The residents own their structures and the subdivided parcels I sold them, but they must notify me if they sell. Karen's association receives no monthly fees. What should be the only fees are property taxes paid through the normal channels. Despite the challenges, I'm glad the situation resolved to help some good people keep their home. At least they didn't lose their property or start over. I'll tell this story forever. When someone complains about their HOA's silly rules, I laugh and say, "That's nothing. Let me tell you about the HOA neighborhood built on my land. I got free houses and pools from an overreaching HOA and a developer who didn't verify land boundaries. It took time, legal battles, and stress, but it worked out. No longer do I owe Karen or her HOA anything for the land or improvements. She tried to push me, but I resisted. I protected my rights and made money with my legal expertise and a network of trusted specialists. What about Karen? She can no longer control me or the innocent families she tried to corral under her questionable leadership. I've never joined her group and never will. Friends, thank you. See you soon.